The stone floor of the high keep archives held the bitter cold of the northern winter, long after the hearth fires had burned down to ash. Elowen knelt on the grey flagstones, her fingers stiff as she gathered the loose pages of the southern border tax ledgers. The air in the lower vault smelled of dry rot, crumbling beeswax, and the metallic tang of old iron gall ink. It was an airless silence that pressed against the eardrums. For Elowen, that exact silence was a carefully calculated sanctuary. She stood, lifting the heavy records, and walked toward the long oak desk tucked into the deepest alcove. The space was divided by a heavy cedar lattice screen. It was an architectural relic from a century prior, designed to separate royal auditors from common clerks. The wood was dark, carved with interlocking knots, and smelled faintly of pine resin. It offered absolute physical separation. It was a boundary line made of timber, and Elowen valued it above everything else in the fortress. Maris Thorn walked past the towering shelves of rolled treaties, carrying a single tallow candle in a battered iron dish. The older archive keeper did not ask if Elowen was cold. Maris cared purely for the preservation of documents, not the fragility of human emotion, which was precisely why Elowen trusted her. Maris set the candle on the far corner of the desk, illuminating a small circle of scratched wood. She tapped a thick, ink-stained finger against the stack of ledgers. The registry for the outer agricultural yields must be catalogued before the morning bell. Maris instructed in a low, gruff rasp, "Do not mix the grain tallies with the iron ore shipments. The ink from the 52nd year of King Alaric's reign smears if you rub the parchment too hard. Handle the pages strictly by the outer margins." Elowen nodded once. She did not speak. She pulled her dark grey wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat in the rigid wooden chair behind the cedar lattice screen. She began to arrange her workspace. The methodical nature of the administrative labour was a kind of armour. She aligned the southern border tax ledgers in a precise column on her left side. She placed a fresh sheet of blotting parchment perfectly in the centre. Then, with careful movements, she adjusted the heavy brass inkwell. She slid it exactly half an inch closer to the edge of her blotting paper, measuring the distance with her knuckle. She did this so she would not have to reach as far across the desk. A shorter reach meant the coarse linen sleeve of her dress would not rustle against the rough oak grain. It meant the metal nib of her quill would not strike the inner lip of the glass with a sharp clink when she dipped it to write. The visitor, who came to the archives after midnight, required a specific kind of quiet. Elowen's employment in this hidden corner depended on her ability to remain unseen and unheard. She dipped the quill into the black ink and waited in the shadow of the screen. The iron hinges of the main archive door groaned precisely as the midnight bell tolled from the upper courtyard. Elowen did not look up. She kept her head angled down, her gaze fixed entirely on the faded script of the provincial financial records. She listened to the measured footsteps crossing the stone floor. They were not the hurried steps of a servant. They were the dragging strides of a man who carried a weight far heavier than the thick velvet cloak sweeping behind him on the flagstones. King Christian Vale stopped on the opposite side of the cedar lattice screen. Through the intricate carved gaps, Elowen could see only the fragmented shadows of his tall frame, settling heavily into the high-backed leather chair reserved for magistrates. He did not demand her attention or issue a decree. He simply sat in the dim candlelight, exhaling a long, ragged breath that sounded like a physical collapse. Christian was a sovereign drowning in the violent legacy of his father's reign. The northern border wars had ended, but the ghosts of Alaric Vale's brutal military expansion refused to let his son sleep. A suffocating insomnia clawed at the young king's mind, driving him out of the opulent royal apartments and down into the drafty corners of the citadel. He had discovered this alcove by accident a week prior. He returned every night since, because of the voice on the other side of the wood. Elowen let the silence stretch for a long, respectful moment. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply looked down at the parchment and began to read exactly where she had left off the previous night. "The winter yield for the province of Oakhaven," she read. Her tone was perfectly flat, completely devoid of any performative sympathy. 300 bushels of winter wheat, harvested before the first frost. 40 barrels of salted venison, treated with ash, 2 wagons of raw iron ore, delayed in transit by 3 weeks. She read the endless agricultural mathematics like a steady drumbeat. It was utterly unsentimental. It was purely factual. It asked absolutely nothing of the listener and demanded no emotional response. On the other side of the cedar lattice screen, Christian let his head fall back against the worn leather of the chair. He closed his eyes. The rigid tension in his jaw, pulled tight since the morning council meetings, finally began to slacken. He listened to the quiet rustle of the ledger pages turning. He listened to the soft, rhythmic scratching of her carefully adjusted quill, making tiny notations in the margins. Most of all, he listened to the unhurried cadence of her voice. It was not a voice trying to flatter a king, nor was it a voice trembling with terror. It was a voice anchored entirely in absolute practical reality. Christian shifted slowly in his chair, leaning slightly closer to the carved wood partition. Without realizing he was doing it, the king synchronized his breathing to the measured pauses in her reading. He breathed in deeply on the tally of the winter wheat. He exhaled a long, slow breath on the count of the salted venison. He did not know her name. He did not know what she looked like beneath her dark shawl. He only knew that in a fortress built on paranoia, this quiet record-keeper behind the wooden screen was the only source of safety he had left in the world. The archive air smelled of dry rot and binding glue. Elowen turned a stiff parchment page of the southern border tax ledgers, the vellum crackling like brittle leaves under her thumb. She kept her voice entirely even, reading the ink tallies exactly as they had been recorded by the treasury scribes 10 winters ago. 400 bushels of winter wheat seized from the river basin, she recited, her tone flat. 200 livestock requisitioned. 7 villages reclassified as vacant territory, acreage annexed to the crown. Behind the carved wooden partition, Christian shifted in his heavy oak chair. The king rarely interrupted, but the stark arithmetic of the old campaigns settled uneasily in the freezing room. Reclassified, Christian repeated, the word carrying a gravelly weight. The official histories frame the southern pacification as a stabilization effort. The records call it stabilization, do they not? The political histories do. Your Grace, Elowen answered quietly. She did not look up, though his broad shoulders blocked the candlelight through the diamond-shaped gaps in the wood. But these are treasury taxation logs. Ledgers do not require poetry. They require mathematics, which is notoriously difficult to intimidate. A village cannot pay taxes if it no longer exists. Elowen continued. The Crown recorded 0 revenue from Oakhaven for 3 years following the Vanguard's march. Grain silos were listed as depleted before winter began. You do not reclassify fertile soil as vacant territory unless the farmers are dead or driven into the frost. Christian went entirely still. Elowen noticed the sudden absence of his breathing. He did not possess the defensive arrogance of his father, Alaric Vale. He possessed only a capacity to listen. My father's generals argued the basin was untamable, Christian said slowly, testing the integrity of the lies he had inherited. They claimed villagers burned their own grain to starve our soldiers. An interesting military theory, Elowen replied, turning a heavy page. However, ledgers from the prior month show a requisition for 60 barrels of pitch, signed by the Inquisitorial Office. Farmers do not burn their own winter stores. If they did, they would not need royal pitch to do it. Christian did not answer. the northern wind battered the stone walls of the keep. The king was beginning to see the shape of the slaughter, not through passionate rebellion, but through the undeniable reality of supply chains. "You speak of the destruction of your region with the detachment of an undertaker," Christian murmured. His voice was close to the lattice, stripped of royal formality. "You recite the erasure of 7 villages, and your breath does not catch. Breath does not alter the past. Your grace," Elowen said. She closed the heavy leather cover, the sound echoing dull and final in the vaulted room. "And grief is not a currency the treasury accepts." Silence settled into the cold stone floor. The sovereign king, commander of vast northern territories, sat paralyzed by a treasury clerk reading old ink. "Who are you?" Christian asked. It was a genuine plea slipping through the wooden barrier. "I come down to this freezing vault night after night. You cure my insomnia with nothing but the cadence of your voice and the cruel honesty of your mind. Yet I do not know what to call you." Elowen's hands stilled. She looked at the heavy timber divider, smelling faintly of beeswax and northern pine. The physical barrier was her only armor, a boundary keeping the High Court's cruelty at bay. She knew exactly what would happen if it fell. "I am the Night Archivist, Your Grace," Elowen answered, her voice impeccably steady, though her knuckles turned white against the desk. "My title is sufficient for the work I perform. A title is a function, not a name," Christian pressed gently. Elowen heard the metallic clink of his signet ring against the wood. "Everyone in this citadel trips over themselves to be noticed by the crown. You hide in the deepest shadows, reading the damning sins of my family's history, and refuse to be known. Being known is a luxury for those who can afford the consequences," Elowen said softly. The king believed visibility was an honor. He did not understand that for a woman carrying the brutal physical marks of his father's government, visibility was synonymous with execution. To be seen by the Old Guard was to be silenced permanently. "Are you afraid of me?" Christian asked. It was the voice of a man exhausted by the Old Guard, desperate for a genuine connection. "No," Elowen replied, realizing with a quiet shock that it was the absolute truth. "I am afraid of the men who wrote these ledgers, Your Grace, and they still stand at your right hand." "Then give me your name," Christian whispered. "Let me pull this screen away. Let me see the woman who understands the cost of my crown better than my own generals." Elowen's breath caught. She looked at the lattice, knowing that if it fell, the fragile sanctuary of these knights would shatter. The son of Alaric Vale would look upon the jagged, melted iron brand across her face, the mark of the sovereign's silence, and see not a wise archivist but a discarded remnant of treason. "The screen stays, Your Grace," Elowen stated, locking her spine. "If my voice serves you, I will read until dawn. But my face belongs entirely to me. If you order this partition removed, I will leave this keep, and you will have to find someone else to lie to you about the past." A heavy silence swallowed the room. Elowen waited, anticipating the sudden crash of authority. Kings did not accept ultimatums from servants. Instead, she heard the slow exhalation of his breath. "The screen stays," Christian conceded, his voice thick with a reluctant, profound respect. "Read the next ledger, Archivist." The temperature inside the high keep archives dropped with the abruptness of a stone falling through still water. Up in the vaulted ceiling, the leaded glass dome began to emit a low, sustained vibration, the sound of ancient metal contracting under immense atmospheric pressure. The winter storms of the northern citadel were rarely quiet affairs, but this incoming gale possessed a feral, physical weight. It smelled of ozone, crushed pine, and the bitter frost that routinely killed crops in the outer valleys. Elowen did not flinch as the first sharp crack of stressed glass echoed through the cavernous chamber. Instead, her hands moved with the practiced, automatic efficiency of someone who valued historical records far above her own immediate comfort. She reached out, her knuckles turning white in the dimness, and carefully pulled the ancient fiscal logs toward the center of the heavy oak desk. She pressed a thick brass weight over the curling parchment, slid the open inkwell deep into the desk drawer, and finally cupped her bare hands around the flickering flame of her tallow candle to keep the violent draughts from snuffing it out. Silence had always been a kind of armor for her, but it offered no tangible protection against the freezing air that was already beginning to swirl aggressively across the floorboards. On the other side of the intricate wooden boundary, the quiet sanctuary fractured. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the chamber swung open with a violent crash, rebounding heavily off the ancient masonry. Christian strode into the room, entirely abandoning the measured, unhurried pace that usually defined his sovereign presence. He was followed by the sharp, overlapping shouts of the royal guard in the corridor, their heavy steel armor clanking loudly as they desperately tried to enforce standard security protocol. The young king ignored them completely. He dismissed the perimeter command with a single, sharp gesture of his hand, forcing the guards to halt abruptly at the threshold. His boots struck the stone floor with heavy, rapid impacts as he crossed the distance to the partition. He did not pause to ask if the archivist was frightened. His attention was entirely captured by the groaning architecture above their heads. The wind was whipping around the exterior of the dome, creating a high-pitched, deafening whistle that made the thick wooden grid rattle violently in its iron wall mounts. Elowen kept her hands cupped around the candle, the meager light casting long, erratic shadows across the intricate woodwork. She urged him to step back, her voice remarkably steady, despite the chaotic noise filling the chamber, warning him that the structural integrity of the roof was rapidly failing. But Christian refused to retreat to the safety of the corridor. He stepped even closer to the trembling partition, his eyes fixed on the straining joints of the wood, anchoring himself in the freezing draught while the gale battered the citadel with terrifying force. The architectural failure did not happen slowly. It occurred in a single, concussive instant of shattering pressure. The leaded glass dome imploded inward, the deafening crack of ancient lead framing, giving way, sounded like a cannon firing within the enclosed stone walls, instantly followed by a torrential cascade of jagged, frost-rimmed glass. Freezing wind howled straight down into the archive chamber, creating a violent downdraft that swallowed the air and instantly extinguished Elowen's solitary candle. Plunged into sudden darkness, the space was immediately lit again by the harsh, unobstructed glare of the winter moonlight pouring through the ruined ceiling. The massive force of the wind hit the ancient wooden barrier like a physical blow from a siege engine. The ancient iron wall mounts, which had held the partition steady for decades, shrieked in protest against the stone. Elowen heard the terrible, metallic screech of thick iron screws tearing free from the crumbling masonry. The heavy wooden barrier tilted backward, losing its structural anchor entirely, with gravity and the freezing wind forcing it to collapse directly toward her desk. Christian did not wait for the screen to fall. He moved on pure, unthinking instinct, launching his body forward into the path of the collapsing debris. He threw his entire weight across the boundary, his heavy winter cloak snapping violently in the gale as he collided with the falling cedar lattice. The impact of solid bone and muscle against the thick wood sent a violent shudder through the entire frame. The king planted his boots against the uneven stone floor, gripping the splintering edges of the lattice and forcing it downward by sheer physical strength, violently redirecting its trajectory away from where Elowen was seated. The heavy partition crashed against the reinforced edge of the oak desk and slammed into the floorboards with a thunderous crack, splitting straight down the center panel. A thick cloud of ancient dust, powdered snow, and fragmented glass shards erupted into the air, settling over the ruined archives in a chaotic, blinding haze. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the chamber was the relentless howling of the wind, roaring through the shattered dome. The scattered gravel and broken glass bit into Christian's palms like shattered teeth, but he did not loosen his tight grip on the ruined wood. Breathing heavily, his chest heaving visibly under his dark coat, he remained kneeling directly in the wreckage of the partition. Slowly, the thick dust began to clear in the cold, silver light of the moon. He shifted his weight, his knuckles tightening as he grabbed the broken upper half of the splintered framework. With a single, forceful shove, the king pushed the heavy wood completely aside, clearing the final physical obstruction between them. He did not ask for permission. He did not wait for her to retreat into the shadows. He simply looked up through the settling debris, the pale moonlight fully illuminating the small space behind the desk, and saw her face clearly for the very first time. The wind from the shattered leaded glass dome howled through the high, cavernous space, carrying with it a bitter flurry of northern snow. The ornate timber partition, which had stood as an impenetrable boundary for 14 nights, now lay splintered across the cold stone floor. Christian remained frozen amid the falling debris. Pale, unforgiving moonlight poured through the jagged opening above, casting harsh illumination across the hidden sanctuary. Elowen did not run. She simply stood by her overturned reading desk, her ledger half buried under a glittering layer of frost and shattered glass. The young ruler remained on his knees, his heavy boots crunching softly over the ruined woodwork as he shifted closer. He had spent weeks falling in love with the measured, intelligent cadence of her voice, building a vivid image of the quiet strength belonging to the woman who held the southern border tax ledgers. Now, the physical barrier was gone. He finally saw her. She held her chin perfectly level, her posture an unyielding, rigid line of defense. She did not attempt to raise a hand to cover her left cheek. She offered no apologies, no flinching retreat, and no tears. She merely faced him, breathing evenly in the freezing air. The moonlight caught the severe, raised tissue stretching from the edge of her jaw, down to the delicate curve of her collarbone. It was not a chaotic battle wound or an accidental burn from a careless hearth. The scar was mathematically precise, deliberate, and undeniably mechanical. The silver iron ridges formed a distinct, intersecting geometric pattern, burned deep into the surrounding flesh. His breath stopped entirely in his throat. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Yet the cold air suddenly felt too thick to inhale. He knew that shape. Every highborn lord in the northern citadel knew that shape, even if they pretended it only existed in dusty, forgotten myths. It was the sovereign's brutal signature. Christian stared at the devastating geometry of the brand. He had seen the original iron tool once, locked away in the deepest restricted vaults of his father's armory. Alaric Vale had commissioned it specifically for the elite inquisitors, a metallurgical nightmare designed to pacify the borderlands. The jagged teeth of the iron were meant to melt flesh and sever vocal cords, leaving the survivors as living, mute monuments to the crown's absolute authority. The realization settled in his chest like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack with freezing dread. He was looking at the undeniable, physical evidence of his dynasty's most unspeakable cruelty, carved permanently into the skin of the woman who had just spent hours soothing his insomnia. The king was not repulsed by the ruin of her beauty. He was paralyzed by the staggering, sickening horror of his own inheritance. The crown he wore, the peace he claimed to uphold, was paid for in the melted flesh of the quiet, brilliant record-keeper standing before him. The very voice he had fallen in love with was one his father's men had actively tried to destroy. His hands fell limply to his sides, the strength draining from his broad shoulders. The silence between them stretched out, fragile and terrifying, swallowed only by the howling winter wind outside. He looked into Elowen's dark, steady eyes. She was waiting for the inevitable reaction. She was waiting for the disgust, the political denial, or the cold royal command to leave his sight forever. She stood absolutely still, her silence a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She catalogued the exact distance to the heavy oak door. She measured the angle of the shattered wood, calculating the safest and most efficient path out of the archives. This was the exact moment she had prepared for. Since the first night, she agreed to read behind the screen. The exposure, the judgment. She tightened her grip on the edge of the overturned desk, her ink-stained fingers digging so hard into the wood that her knuckles turned stark white. She would not plead. She would not explain the terror of the Inquisitors, or the phantom smell of burning skin that still haunted her waking hours. She merely waited for the Alpha King to play his inherited part. Instead, the Sovereign crumbled. He did not step back. He did not issue a sharp command or avert his gaze in aristocratic shame. He simply let go of his towering, rigid composure. His knees hit the freezing stone floor with a heavy, hollow thud, completely uncaring of the sharp shards of glass scattered across the flagstones. The heavy, fur-lined velvet of his royal coat settled into the dust and the accumulating snow. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders trembling visibly under the weight of an unbearable, suffocating remorse. Elowen stopped breathing. Her tactical calculations fractured into 1,000 useless pieces. Powerful men did not kneel. Alpha Kings did not drop to the floor in the dirt before low-ranking archive assistants. They demanded loyalty. They did not offer penance. Christian reached out, his movements agonizingly slow, and gently took her trembling, ink-stained hands in his own. He pressed his forehead against her knuckles. The touch was not demanding, nor was it possessive. It was a desperate, shattered plea for a forgiveness he knew with absolute certainty he had not earned. The cold metal of his signet ring dug slightly into her skin, providing a sharp, grounding contrast to the sudden, shocking warmth of his tears spilling over her fingers. He wept in absolute silence. There were no grand, empty declarations of justice, no immediate political promises meant to comfort her, and no arrogant assumptions that he could fix a decade of trauma with a single royal decree. There was only the raw, devastating grief of a son bearing the full, crushing weight of his father's atrocities. The tears soaked into her skin, warm and heavy, carrying a profound vulnerability that terrified her far more than any anger ever could. She stood frozen, looking down at the dark hair of the most powerful man in the northern citadel, now bowed in complete submission at her feet. The violent wind continued to tear through the broken roof, rustling the loose parchment of the tax ledgers, but inside the center of the archive, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. He was not claiming her. He was surrendering to the truth she carried. The gravel of the broken glass crunched beneath his knees as he shifted his weight, burying his face deeper into her palms, anchoring himself to the only honest thing left in his corrupt kingdom. For the first time in 10 years, Elowen did not feel the phantom heat of the Inquisitor's iron burning against her neck. She only felt the desperate, yielding reverence of a king who had finally seen the true cost of his crown and who was willingly choosing to let it break him. Eventually, the scraping of stiff boar bristle against cold stone cut through the howling wind. Maris Thorn moved methodically across the ruined chamber. She swept the jagged, frosted fragments of the leaded glass dome into a neat pile near the base of the fallen cedar lattice. The older keeper did not offer useless exclamations about the shattered partition, nor did she ask why. The young monarch knelt in the debris. She simply draped a heavy, undyed wool blanket over Elowen's shoulders and returned to her broom, her focus entirely on clearing the walkways to the lower stacks. Snow drifted through the gaping hole in the ceiling, settling like fine white ash over the ancient oak reading tables. The delicate climate balance of the high keep archives was gone. Within minutes, the temperature plummeted, turning the air into a biting, freezing current that seeped through the thickest garments. Christian slowly stood, his dark leather boots crunching over the glass. He kept his hands at his sides, maintaining a careful, respectful distance. His gaze remained locked on the jagged silver tissue spanning the left side of Elowen's face. His breathing was shallow, tightly controlled against the shock. "You cannot stay here," the king said. His voice was a low, measured drawl, devoid of its usual sovereign authority, and replaced entirely by a quiet pleading. "The temperature is dropping too fast. The northern gales will freeze this room solid by dawn. I will have the guards prepare a suite in the inner apartments. It is warm there. It is safe." Elowen did not look up. She pulled the blanket tighter around her collar with one hand, while the other reached for a thick, leather-bound volume knocked askew when the heavy screen fell. The cover was dusted with wet snow and fine, glittering shards of glass. "The southern border tax ledgers must be secured," she said. Her tone carried the exact same calm, intellectual cadence she had used every night behind the partition. "Moisture will ruin the untreated vellum. If the iron gall ink bleeds, the tax histories and property lines of 3 entire provinces will be lost. The ledgers can wait," Christian urged, taking half a step closer but stopping immediately when her shoulders stiffened. "The inner apartments are heavily guarded. No one from the old guard will question your presence if I command it. Let me take you away from this cold." She picked up a dry linen cloth from her inkstand. With slow, deliberate strokes, she wiped the melting snow and soot from the cover of the damaged document. She checked the spine, running her thumb along the stitching to ensure the structural integrity held, before stacking it safely beneath the overhang of the desk. The preservation of truth required meticulous labor, and she would not let a winter storm erase the evidence she had spent months cataloging. "My place is with the records," she answered, finally raising her eyes to meet his. The pale moonlight illuminated the mark of the sovereign's silence across her jaw, turning the melted iron scar into a stark, undeniable map of systemic cruelty. "I do not require a velvet suite, Your Majesty. I require a dry alcove for these texts, and perhaps another oil lantern." Christian stared at her hands, noting the dark ink stains on her knuckles and the absolute steadiness of her posture. She was not a fragile thing waiting to be rescued and tucked away in a gilded room. She was the anchor of this repository. He recognized the boundary she had drawn. Despite the agonizing remorse tearing at his chest, he nodded. He would not force her from the only sanctuary she had built. "Maris," Christian said, his voice tightening as he turned toward the older archivist. "Unlock the lower vault. It is insulated there. I will help you move the eastern tables." Without waiting for permission, the king stripped off his heavy fur-lined cloak, laying it over the remaining dry documents, and bent down to lift the massive oak table himself. The lower vault smelled of dry pine resin, stale parchment, and old beeswax. It was a cramped, windowless space, lined with iron-reinforced shelves that successfully blocked the freezing draft from the ruined chamber above. Stacks of unsealed tax histories lined the walls, waiting to be properly catalogued. A single tallow candle burned on a small reading desk, casting long, flickering shadows against the cold stone blocks. Elowen sat on a simple wooden stool, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Christian remained standing near the heavy iron door. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He watched her breath bloom into small white clouds in the freezing air, waiting. He asked for nothing. He demanded neither the story of her past nor her comfort for his own guilt, letting the quiet stretch until she was ready to break it. 10 years ago, Elowen began, her voice steady and entirely unhurried. The Old Guard moved through the southern provinces to suppress the wintergrain riots. They did not bring magistrates to hear the grievances. They brought inquisitors. Christian's jaw tightened. The border purges were recorded in the official royal histories. As necessary pacifications, bloodless administrative corrections meant to stabilize the realm. The lie had worn grooves into his chest for years, but hearing her confirm it shattered the final illusion. My father was a village scribe, she continued, looking not at the king, but at the flickering candle flame. He kept accurate counts of the harvest, down to the last bushel of winter wheat. When the Inquisitor generals arrived to requisition the grain for the capital, the physical numbers did not match their official demands. He refused to amend the ledgers to hide their theft. She lifted her right hand. Slowly, without a single tremble, she traced her ink-stained fingertips along the thick, raised edge of the scar on her neck. She followed the brutal geometry of the brand, showing him exactly where the hot iron had been pressed into her flesh. The mark of the sovereign silence, she said softly. It is an administrative tool. They do not use it to kill. They use it to ensure that those who witness the crown's theft are too permanently disfigured to ever step forward in a public tribunal. She described the smell of burning copper and ozone. She detailed the heavy weight of the Inquisitor's steel-toed boot pinning her shoulder to the gravel and the sound of her father's execution in the courtyard. She spoke of the cold logistics of state torture. She explained how long the iron took to cool against her jaw and how the wounds were immediately packed with dirty snow to stop the bleeding. So the victims would survive as living warnings to the rest of the province. There were no tears in her eyes. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Her grief had calcified long ago into a cold, unbreakable resolve, leaving only a methodical demand for justice. That lack of weeping was what broke him completely. Christian felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. The king leaned back against the heavy iron door, his hands gripping the cold handle behind him until his knuckles turned bone white, anchoring himself to the material world. The voice he had fallen in love with, the calm, brilliant cadence that lulled him to sleep through his darkest nights, was forged in the fires of his own father's corruption. "I am sorry," Christian whispered. The words sounded pathetic, utterly hollow, against the crushing, documented weight of her history. "I did not know. Ignorance, it is the privilege of the highest rank," Elowen answered quietly. She dropped her hand from her neck, letting the scar remain exposed in the amber light. "But you know now. The question is not what your father did, but what you will do with the records he tried to bury." She did not ask for his pity. She asked for his jurisdiction. And in that freezing, shadow-drenched vault, Christian realized that loving her meant dismantling the very foundation of his own throne. The council chamber of the High Keep felt colder than the open battlements. Morning light barely penetrated the narrow, lead-lined windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak table. Christian stood at the head of the room. He did not sit. He watched the man occupying the high-backed chair to his right, measuring the precise geometry of the older man's relaxed posture. Varric Sloane wore the immaculate dark wool of a former Inquisitor General. His hands, adorned with heavy gold signets, rested comfortably on the table's surface by a stack of routine agricultural reports. He looked entirely at ease, projecting the practiced patience of an elder statesman indulging a young, inexperienced ruler. He belonged to a generation that viewed the current sovereign as a boy who needed to be managed rather than a king who needed to be obeyed. The Southern pacification campaigns, Varric repeated, his voice smooth, carrying the faint rasp of expensive tobacco. A difficult era, Your Grace, but a necessary one. Your father understood the burden of securing the borders. I am not asking for a philosophical defense of my father's reign, the king said. His tone was perfectly level, stripped of all inflection. He slid a single piece of parchment across the oak table. It was a copy of the supply lines his archivist had deciphered the night before. I am asking for the chain of command. You signed the requisition forms for 300 iron brands to be shipped to the border outposts. I want the names of the men who held the inquisitorial seals during those autumn purges. The older man glanced at the parchment, but he did not pick it up. He smiled, a shallow expression that did not reach his pale eyes. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, a slow, deliberate movement designed to project unshakable authority. Those records were decentralized for a reason. The officers who carried out those orders did so to protect this court. It is terrible business, maintaining an empire, best left in the past, where the blood has long since dried. Christian placed his palms flat against the cold wood of the table. He did not growl. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy, suffocating. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nothing has dried, Christian said quietly. Varric's smile faltered by a fraction of an inch. His knuckles whitened slightly against the arms of his chair. You are looking for ghosts, Your Grace. It is a dangerous habit for a new sovereign. You rely on the military stability provided by the Old Guard. I strongly advise you not to open wounds that have already healed. The king straightened. He looked at the polished military medals pinned to the general's chest, feeling a deep physical revulsion settle in his stomach. The men who had burned villages and mutilated civilians were sitting in this very fortress, wearing velvet and issuing diplomatic advice. They believed themselves untouchable because the paperwork had been buried. We are done here, Christian commanded, turning his back on the general. He had his answer. The official archives were sanitized, scrubbed clean by men who knew how to hide their cruelty behind bureaucratic protocol. If he wanted to dismantle their power, he could not ask the men who had written the lies. He had to dig beneath them. The restricted lower vaults beneath the high keep smelled of rust, damp earth, and decaying parchment. It was a place designed to be forgotten, secured behind heavy iron grates that had not been unlocked since Alaric Vale's death. Elowen walked down the spiraling stone steps, holding a single beeswax candle high enough to cast a trembling circle of amber light. The air down here was freezing, biting brutally through the thin wool of her dress, but she moved with absolute certainty. The shadows stretched and warped against the curved ceilings, revealing rows of massive, iron-bound chests stacked against the weeping stone walls. Water dripped methodically in the distance, measuring out the seconds in the absolute dark. Christian followed closely behind her. He wore no crown, no velvet mantle, only a plain dark tunic and heavy leather boots. Here, in the buried dark of the fortress, he was not the sovereign demanding answers from a corrupt court. He was merely a man carrying the heavy iron keys to his father's locked history. The king stepped past her to approach the primary grate, inserting a massive, rusted key into the central mechanism. It required his full physical weight to force the internal tumblers to turn. The metal groaned in protest before finally giving way with a loud, hollow crack. They would not have destroyed the original logs, the archivist murmured, her voice steady in the vast, echoing silence as they stepped into the main vault. She set the candle down on a stone plinth, illuminating a sprawling maze of neglected records. Bureaucrats are fundamentally cowards. They keep records of their crimes as insurance against each other. If the primary treasury logs were indexed by region, the inquisitors would have mirrored that structure down here. Then it is here, he answered, stepping up beside her, his breath plumbing in the freezing air. The secret inquisitorial registry. Elowen nodded once. She approached the nearest row of chests, utilizing her deep understanding of the keep's archival geometry. She walked past 3 rows of military supply logs and stopped before a low, unremarkable chest tucked against the furthest, dampest wall. She knelt on the freezing flagstones, gripping the rusted iron handle of the massive trunk. It was too heavy for her to lift alone. The king immediately dropped to one knee beside her. He did not order her to step aside, nor did he attempt to take over the physical labor to show his strength. Instead, he reached out, wrapping his large, warm hand directly over her cold, ink-stained fingers on the iron latch. She froze. For a fraction of a second, the breath caught in her throat. He did not pull away. The intense heat of his palm seeped through her chilled skin, offering a silent, undeniable grounding in the dark. They were not touching out of desperation or sudden passion, but out of a shared, meticulous focus. He waited for her subtle nod. Together, they pulled upward, their combined strength forcing the heavy lid open. The rusted hinges screamed into the quiet vault, dust plumed into the candlelight. Inside, stacked in neat, damning rows, were black leather-bound books tied with thick cord. Elowen released the iron handle, her fingers trembling very slightly, though whether from the cold or the proximity of the man beside her, she did not know. Christian remained kneeling on the stone, his shoulder brushing hers as they peered into the chest. They carried it to a low stone table in the deepest chamber of the high keep, where the air was thick with the scent of undisturbed dust, damp stone, and decaying leather. Resting between Elowen and Christian, the secret inquisitorial registry did not look like a weapon of mass slaughter. It was bound in unassuming dark calfskin, its iron clasps dull and heavy with age, appearing no different from a standard grain tally. Elowen did not search blindly. She knew the exact financial quarters of the border campaigns. She turned the thick vellum pages slowly, tracking the dates with a quiet, devastating efficiency, her breath shallow in the freezing draft. Christian stood perfectly still beside her, holding an iron lantern high so the yellow light spilled across the mathematical columns of death. The inquisitors had been meticulous accountants. Executions, border purges, and the requisition of branding irons were neatly tallied alongside the cost of transport and firewood, masking atrocities beneath the banal language of imperial logistics. Elowen's eyes scanned the precise, emotionless ledgers, translating the administrative shorthand she had spent years mastering in the dark. She did not cry. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of men who held power over her survival. Instead, her posture grew rigid, the line of her spine snapping straight. She stopped, turning the pages. Silence settled over the stone table. Not an empty quiet, but a suffocating weight that pressed the breath from their lungs. She reached out. Her index finger, usually so steady when tracing tariff lines, trembled visibly as it came to rest against a specific block of text halfway down the page. It was an execution tally for a small, unnamed southern village. Below the calculated cost of destroyed homes and silenced witnesses sat a perfectly legible, looping signature in dried black ink. "Magistrate Jalen Voss," Elowen whispered. The gravel in her throat caught on the syllables, scraping against the quiet of the vault. She did not look at Christian, keeping her eyes fixed on the precise handwriting that had unmade her life. He authorized the fire. He personally requisitioned the iron for the brands. She finally lifted her face. The lantern light caught the jagged, melted silver ravines of the scar stretching from her jawline down beneath her collar. "The man who signed this order still sits on your High Judicial Council, Your Grace. He judges the laws of the Northern Citadel today." Christian stared at the dry ink on the vellum. His knuckles turned the color of bleached bone where he gripped the lantern handle. He did not roar. He did not shatter the glass in his hand. He absorbed the truth with a terrifying, absolute stillness. The rot of King Alaric Vale's reign was not buried in the past. It was sitting at his own council table, drafting modern laws and wearing the clean, unbloodied robes of justice. The royal library on the upper floors offered a stark contrast to the freezing subterranean vaults, smelling of polished cedar, fresh beeswax candles, and the subtle smoke of a roaring hearth. It was a space designed for civilized men, and Jalen Voss looked entirely at home within it. The High Marshal stood before the massive stone fireplace, a portrait of high-born ease and untouchable privilege. He wore a surcoat of deep indigo velvet, the fabric heavy and rich, lined with silver thread that caught the warm light of the flames. He looked nothing like a butcher who had ordered villages burned to ash. He looked exactly like the respected elder statesman the court believed him to be. Christian sat behind his massive oak desk, his face a carefully constructed mask of sovereign composure. He watched the older man with eyes that gave nothing away, though his pulse thudded a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Jalen casually raised a hand to adjust his rich silk cuffs, smoothing the expensive fabric with his thumb in a display of absolute, unbothered indifference. It was the gesture of a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. "The council grows concerned, Your Grace," Jalen said smoothly, his voice a polished hum that echoed pleasantly off the high bookshelves. "There are whispers in the corridors. They say you spend too much time in the dust of the lower vaults, dwelling on obscure history rather than looking to the future of the citadel." Christian kept his posture perfectly relaxed, leaning back against the carved wood of his chair. "History provides the necessary context for the future, Lord Voss. I am simply reviewing the foundation upon which this court was built." Jalen smiled. It was a thin, patronizing expression, the look of a seasoned predator indulging a naive boy. "Indeed, but your esteemed father, King Alaric, understood that some history is best left undisturbed for the sake of the realm's stability. Half the lords in this citadel owe their current prosperity and their vast lands to his decisive pacifications of the border. To question his methods now, or to dig up old grievances, might make those loyal families very nervous. Nervous men make for a fractured kingdom. It was a flawlessly executed threat, delivered wrapped in the velvet of diplomatic advice. Jalen was calmly reminding the young king that the Old Guard held the wealth, the swords, and the political foundation of the territory. They were the system. Christian looked at Jalen's unblemished, perfectly manicured hands resting against the silk cuffs. He thought of the jagged, melted iron scar on Elowen's neck, the permanent physical cost of the older man's administrative efficiency. A cold, violent urge tightened in Christian's chest, demanding he order the royal guards to drag the magistrate to the courtyard and hang him from the nearest iron gate. But the law required undeniable, public proof, not private vengeance. Executing a high marshal in a fit of rage would only make Jalen a martyr to the Old Guard, burying the truth forever. Down in the lower vault, the cold crept up through the floor, seeping into her boots. Elowen's gaze was locked on the closed cover of the secret inquisitorial registry. The heavy, iron-bound book sat on the scarred reading desk, anchoring the entire room in a terrible, suffocating gravity. She had spent decades learning how to swallow her tears in front of those who would never understand why. Now, even in the absolute privacy of the deepest archive, the tears refused to come. Instead, a quiet, crushing pressure built behind her ribs, her breath hitched, turning shallow and erratic. The phantom heat of the melted iron brand flared across her cheek and neck, her fingers curled inward, nails digging into her palms until the skin threatened to break. The silence in the stone chamber was absolute. She tried to stand, but her knees refused to lock. The meticulous handwriting detailing the execution orders of her family played behind her eyelids in a relentless loop. At the far end of the chamber, A heavy wooden door creaked open on rusted hinges. Maris Thorn did not rush. The older woman moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades categorizing the ruined. She carried a chipped, glazed clay mug between her palms. The sharp scent of roasted chicory root drifted into the stagnant air, cutting through the smell of old parchment and dust. Maris did not ask what was wrong. She set the steaming mug directly over the center of the closed registry, obscuring the iron crest on its cover. "Drink," the keeper ordered, her voice flat but anchored in unshakable reality. Elowen stared down at the thin curls of rising steam. Her hands were shaking so violently she did not dare reach out. Seeing the tremor, Maris stepped closer. She possessed hands permanently stained with ink. She reached out, taking the younger woman's freezing fingers, guiding them to wrap around the heated clay. The warmth bled slowly into the numbness. "Breathe in the steam," Maris instructed, using the measured cadence she reserved for reciting catalogue numbers. "Count to 4. Then let it out." Elowen obeyed. The chicory was bitter and grounding. She took a slow, shuddering breath. The tension in her chest began to uncoil, leaving a hollow exhaustion. "I saw their signatures," Elowen whispered, her voice barely carrying over the faint crackle of the torches. "The men who held the iron, they are still here, walking the upper halls in silk, pretending the southern border was a glorious victory." Maris stepped back to lean against the wooden shelves. They built their power on the assumption that the dead do not speak. But they made a mistake when they left you alive to organize their lies. They hold all the power in the council. One ledger might not be enough. "Power is an agreed-upon fiction," Maris replied, crossing her arms over her wool apron. "Fiction cannot survive documented proof." The men who signed those orders thought they were writing the history of the realm. But you are the one holding the book now. She tapped the rim of the mug. "Survivors write the final, true ledger of the dead. Finish your tea. The king will need your mind sharp for what comes next." Elowen nodded, lifting the cup to her lips. The bitter liquid settled in her stomach like a quiet promise. 3 floors above the damp silence of the lower vaults, the northern wind howled against the narrow arrow slits of the upper corridors, driving fine sprays of ice through the gaps. The iron wall sconces here burned bright and steady, illuminating heavy woven tapestries that depicted ancient pack victories. Varric Sloane stood in the deep shadow of a marble archway. He wore an immaculate midnight blue coat with silver embroidery at the cuffs, occupying the space with smooth, performative elegance. He waited perfectly still for the frustrated footsteps approaching from the gallery. Jalen Voss rounded the corner, his winter cloak smelling faintly of wet wool and ozone. The High Marshal's face was flushed with poorly concealed rage. He cast a paranoid glance down the corridor before turning to the older man. "The boy is completely out of his depth," Jalen hissed. "He is demanding access to the restricted archives." Varric adjusted the tapestry beside him. "King Christian is young. The young are burdened by an exhausting sense of moral obligation. It usually passes once they realize how expensive morality truly is. He is looking for the old registries. If he finds the specific orders we signed 10 years ago..." "He will not find them," Varric interrupted, his tone as smooth and cold as a frozen lake, "because they will no longer exist by morning." Jalen exhaled a tense breath. "You have a solution. 10 years ago, we were tasked with clearing out the southern resistance," the former inquisitor corrected gently. "In our haste to finalize the pacification, it appears we left a minor clerical error uncorrected." "The girl," Jalen muttered, realization dawning with grim finality. Varric offered a thin, mirthless smile. To him, Elowen was nothing more than a misplaced comma in a ledger. "A foolish oversight on our part. We assumed the winter exposure would finish the job the iron started. If she has already located the hidden ledger of atrocities, she could present it to the High Council." Which is why the registry and the girl must both be removed tonight, Varric said softly. We must erase the error. The Marshal nodded, panic shifting into cold calculation. I cannot use the Royal Guard. The King has been rotating their shifts. I have already sent word to the outer perimeter, Varric replied smoothly. A team of unsanctioned mercenaries will breach the lower vaults within the hour. It will look like a simple burglary gone wrong. And the ledger will be burned, the older man confirmed, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. Along with anyone found reading it. By dawn, the King will have a tragic accident to mourn. Jalen let out a low breath of relief. See that it is done quickly. I do not want to stand before the tribunal answering for ghosts. Varric stepped out of the shadows. Ghosts only exist when you fail to bury them properly. Tonight, we finish the paperwork. The archives were colder than usual, the draft from the ruined leaded glass dome above still carrying the sharp scent of northern frost. Elowen sat at the long oak table, her ink-stained fingers resting lightly over the leather cover of the black-bound Book of Purges. She was alone. Maris had stepped out to fetch more tallow candles, leaving the great chamber bathed in a single flickering pool of amber light. The warning came not as a shout, but as a subtle friction against the heavy iron hinges of the corridor door. Elowen did not look up immediately. She simply stopped breathing. The sound was wrong. It was not the measured, heavy tread of the Royal Guard, nor the brisk, practical shuffle of the archive keeper. It was the soft, deliberate drag of damp wool and leather soles trying to remain silent on the stone. The heavy oak door did not swing open. It splintered inward with a violent crack. 3 men spilled into the room. They wore no house colours, their faces obscured by dark linen wraps, but the drawn steel in their hands caught the candlelight. They did not look at the gold ornaments on the walls or the silver candelabras in the corner. Their eyes locked instantly on the table. On the ledger, they had not come to assassinate a king. They had come to kill a record. Fear was an old, familiar current in Elowen's veins, but it did not paralyze her. It clarified her vision. She did not scream or beg. Instead, her hands moved with the practiced, ruthless efficiency of a woman who knew that history was more fragile than bone. She snatched the secret inquisitorial registry from the table, stepping backward into the deep shadows of the towering shelves. Grab the book, the lead mercenary hissed, his voice muffled by thick linen. Burn the rest. They lunged across the stone floor, their heavy boots scattering loose parchment. Elowen dropped to her knees behind the heavy reading desk. Beneath it sat the archive's primary strongbox, forged from solid winter iron. She threw the leather-bound registry inside, the impact making a dull, heavy thud against the metal. A hand closed around her shoulder, thick fingers digging brutally into her collarbone, dragging her backward before she could secure the lid. Before the mercenary could raise his blade, the air in the room shifted. A shadow detached itself from the corridor doorway, moving with unhurried precision. Christian did not shout a battle cry. He occupied the violence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill the silence. He caught the mercenary's raised wrist, twisting it sharply until the joint gave way with a dry snap. The man dropped, choking on a scream. "Lock it," the king ordered, his voice low and entirely calm, his gaze never leaving the remaining 2 attackers. Elowen slammed the iron lid shut. She grabbed the brass key hanging from her belt, forced it into the mechanism, and turned it until the tumblers fell into place. With a heavy click, she pulled the key free and closed her fist around it. The evidence was safe. Christian stepped fully into the room, placing his body squarely between Elowen and the intruders. He did not draw a heavy broadsword. He held a simple hunting dagger, his posture relaxed, his breathing even. The 2 remaining mercenaries hesitated, the sudden appearance of the sovereign fracturing their coordination. They rushed him together. Christian did not retreat. He stepped inside the arc of the first blade, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him crashing backward into a shelf of old tax records. The second attacker thrust low. Christian pivoted, catching the man's forearm and using the mercenary's own momentum to slam him face first into the solid oak desk. The fight ended in less than 30 seconds. Not a chaotic brawl, but a systematic dismantling. Christian stood over the fallen men, his dark winter cloak barely out of place, the faint metallic tang of fresh blood mingling with the scent of old paper and dust. Silence reclaimed the archives, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the men bleeding on the cold stone floor. Elowen remained kneeling beside the strongbox, the brass key biting into her palm like broken teeth. She watched the king. She waited for the feral rage, for the loss of control that always accompanied violence in the high court. It never came. Christian slowly wiped the edge of his dagger against the cloak of the unconscious man at his feet and sheathed it. He did not look at the blood. He looked at Elowen. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his tone dropping the commanding edge of the sovereign and returning to the quiet, careful cadence he had always used with her behind the partition. "I am unhurt," she answered. Her voice was perfectly steady, though her knuckles were white. "The registry is secured." Rapid footsteps echoed down the corridor. Maris rushed into the chamber, a heavy iron lantern held high, her practical eyes sweeping over the splintered door, the scattered parchment, and the groaning men. The archive keeper did not gasp or ask foolish questions. She simply set the lantern down on the edge of the desk and knelt beside the closest attacker, pulling back the dark linen wrap to inspect his face. "I do not know these men," Maris stated flatly. "They are not part of the Royal Guard." Christian crouched beside the man he had thrown against the desk. The mercenary was groaning, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. The king reached out and took hold of the man's limp right hand. He did not ask for a confession. He simply turned the thick fingers toward the lantern light. A heavy silver signet ring rested on the mercenary's index finger. It bore the unmistakable, deeply etched sigil of a roaring bear. "They do not need to wear colors," Christian said softly. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver through the ambient air. "This is the mark of the private garrison." Varric Sloane's personal guard. Elowen experienced the dull, inevitable ache of a long-dreaded certainty finally arriving. The former Inquisitor General had finally made his move. Varric knew that if the Ledger survived the night, his legacy of sanctioned atrocities would be dragged into the light. Maris looked at the king, her weathered face grim. "They broke into the royal archives with drawn steel. It is high treason. You have the right to execute them where they lie, Your Grace." No one in the court would question it. For a long moment, Christian stared at the ring. The old laws of his father's reign demanded blood for blood. A swift, quiet execution in the dark was how the old guard maintained their terror. It was how they had silenced villages. He released the man's hand and stood up. "No," Christian commanded, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "We will not kill them in the shadows. That is Varric's way. That is the way of the old court." He turned to Elowen, his eyes finding the jagged, silver-iron scar, the undeniable emblem of absolute suppression that stretched across her cheek and neck. The sight of it brought profound, agonizing remorse into his expression, a quiet grief he never tried to hide. "If we execute them here, the court will say it was a misunderstanding." Christian continued, his gaze locked on hers, seeking her permission as much as declaring his intent. "Varric will deny them. He will claim they acted alone, and the system that protects him will endure." Elowen slowly opened her hand, looking down at the brass key resting in her palm. The metal was warm from her grip. She understood what he was offering. Not vengeance, but justice. Not a swift end, but a structural dismantling. "Bind them," Christian ordered, turning his attention to the corridor where the first royal guards were finally rushing forward. their swords drawn. Take them to the deepest holding cells. Let them heal enough to stand before the lords of the realm. When the room was empty again, save for the three of them, Christian knelt slowly before the heavy iron strongbox. He did not ask for the key. He simply rested his hand against the cold metal lid, anchoring himself. He sent them to destroy the truth, Christian murmured, the anger finally bleeding through his controlled facade. They failed, Elowen replied quietly. She stepped closer, not hiding her scarred face in the shadows. The records remain, and now we have the men who tried to burn them. Christian looked up at her, the respect in his eyes absolute and unwavering. Then we let them live, long enough for the entire court to watch Varric fall by the very law he claimed to serve. The antechamber to the great hall smelled of aged beeswax and freezing limestone. Elowen stood near the massive hearth, though the fire had burned down to white ash, offering no heat against the bitter morning. The reality of what she was about to do settled into her bones, heavy and jagged. For years, her survival had depended on remaining unseen. She had existed as a ghost in the High Keep archives, protected by dark corners and the cedar lattice screen. Now, she was preparing to walk into the brightest room in the northern citadel, carrying the secret inquisitorial registry and the proof of her ruin. The branded tissue felt tight against her cheek, the scar tissue aching in the winter draught. It was not death she feared. She had survived the purges of the southern borderlands and the Inquisitor's branding iron. What terrified her was the spectacle. The thought of hundreds of polished lords staring at her ruined face with revulsion and aristocratic pity made her breath catch. She closed her eyes, gripping the edges of her woolen shawl. It was too thin. Everything felt too thin. "You are shivering." The voice was low, devoid of pity, and perfectly steady. Elowen opened her eyes to see Christian stepping out of the shadows. He did not attempt to crowd her space. He stopped 3 paces away, assessing the rigid line of her shoulders. He wore the formal attire of the sovereign court, but his expression held only the quiet focus of a man who knew exactly how much pressure a fragile structure could take. "I am calculating," Elowen answered, a faint tremor in her voice. She smoothed her skirt to hide her anxiety. "The Great Hall has 400 seats. I have spent my entire adult life learning how to avoid even one." Christian did not offer false comfort. Instead, he unfastened the silver clasp at his throat. The heavy royal winter cloak slid from his shoulders with a soft rush of thick fabric. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and settled the immense garment over Elowen. The physical impact of the cloak was immediate. Lined with dense northern wolf fur and thick velvet, it smelled faintly of pine needles, ozone, and cold iron. It dropped over her like a localized gravity, anchoring her trembling frame to the stone floor. Elowen reached up, her fingers gripping the wide lapels. She pulled the heavy velvet tight around herself, burying her chin into the fur collar. She did not care that this was a symbol of absolute sovereign authority, a garment meant only for the ruling bloodline. To her, it was simply weight. It was a tangible, physical barrier between her vulnerable skin and the freezing hostility of the world outside the antechamber. "Better?" Christian asked quietly. "It is heavy," she murmured, her breathing slowing into a measured rhythm. "It is," he agreed. "Let it carry the weight for you today. I will carry the rest." Beyond the antechamber, the oak doors of the great hall stood open, spilling harsh light into the corridor. Christian walked through the archway without looking back, trusting Elowen to follow when she was ready. She remained in the shadows, her face obscured by a thick linen veil, the heavy cloak hiding the remaining tremor in her hands. The great hall was a cavernous space of vaulted ceilings and tiered seating, packed with the highest-ranking nobles of the territory. The air hummed with speculative murmurs. At the center of the first tier sat Varric Sloane and Jalen Voss, wearing the polished insignia of the Old Guard. Heavy medals were pinned to their chests, honors they had earned during the brutal pacification of the borderlands. They were entirely secure in the belief that whatever unrest had summoned this emergency tribunal, their rank would insulate them from consequence. They had operated in the shadows for a decade. They did not fear the light. Christian walked down the central aisle. The murmurs died instantly. The entire hall, orienting toward his unhurried progression, the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. He ascended the shallow stone steps of the dais and turned to face the assembly. He did not sit. "Seal the doors," Christian commanded. At the perimeter of the hall, the royal guards stepped forward in perfect unison. The massive iron hinges groaned as the heavy oak doors were hauled shut. The thick iron crossbars, slamming into their brackets, echoed like cannon fire. Panic rippled through the seated nobles. A tribunal with sealed doors was an ancient protocol, invoked only for charges of high treason. Jalen shifted in his seat, his bored confidence fracturing. Varric narrowed his eyes, his polished veneer tightening into cold calculation. A seneschal approached the dais, carrying the ceremonial crown of the northern citadel upon a velvet cushion. It was a heavy circle of wrought iron and diamonds, the exact crown Alaric Vale had worn when he signed the orders that burned the borderlands. The seneschal knelt, offering the symbol of absolute power to the young king. Christian looked down at the crown. For a long moment, the only sound in the vast chamber was the freezing wind howling against the high exterior glass. The silence in the hall stretched, brittle and dangerous. Every breath in the cavernous room seemed suspended. "Take it away," Christian said. The seneschal blinked, his hands trembling. "Your Grace," I said, "take it away," Christian repeated, his tone dropping into a deadly register. He finally took his seat upon the cold stone throne. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs, his gaze sweeping over the assembled lords before lingering on Jalen and Varric. "This court is convened as a high tribunal, but I will not wear the crown of my father today. I will not place that iron upon my head until the rot he planted in this foundation has been exposed, cut out, and burned." The words settled in the room like heavy stones dropping into a still, dark well. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. Jalen gripped the wooden armrests of his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the absolute quiet. "We are here," Christian continued, his voice echoing off the high walls, "to unseal the past, to prosecute the crimes committed in the shadows of the Old Guard. Justice today will not be determined by inherited rank, nor will it be obscured by political loyalty. It will be determined by the official record, by the ledgers your inquisitors thought were buried, and we will not leave this room until the truth has been spoken in the light." The great hall smelled of burning beeswax and the metallic tang of winter air. Jalen Voss stood in the center of the mosaic floor, with his shoulders thrown back. He wore the deep maroon velvet of the Old Guard's High Marshal, delivering his defense with the booming confidence of an officer who believed rank was an impenetrable shield. "These accusations are nothing but ink and spite," Jalen declared, gesturing dismissively toward the early tax ledgers laid out on the table. "Are we to be dismantled by paper?" He turned his back on the throne, pacing a slow arc to appeal directly to the assembled peers in the tiered wooden benches. "You all know how easy it is to forge a tax record, how simple it is to alter a date, to manufacture atrocities that never happened. They wish to criminalize the expansion that built this fortress." The older lords shifted, heavy woolen cloaks rustling. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the lower tiers. Jalen was weaponizing their fear, framing the investigation as an attack on the state itself to rally a conservative coup within the courtroom. A few paces away, Varric Sloane stood in perfect stillness. The former Inquisitor General watched the shifting loyalties with deadpan calculation, offering a subtle nod to a neighboring duke. They were preparing to vote the charges down through sheer numerical authority. Christian watched them from the high seat. He did not interrupt or demand order from his guards. He held the quiet without apology, lacking the nervous impulse to fill empty air. He simply rested his forearms on the carved chair, waiting until Jalen finished his sweeping appeal, and the hall settled into a tense, expectant atmosphere. "Forged records," Christian said softly, the entire hall naturally orienting toward him. "You claim the ledgers are political fabrications, that the violence in the South is a myth." "I claim that paper can lie, Your Majesty," Jalen answered smoothly, offering a shallow, insolent bow, "and that a man's legacy should not be stripped by anonymous ink." Christian tilted his head slightly. "I agree." He gave a slight motion of his hand toward the shadowed archway behind the dais. Elowen stepped out from the darkness of the pillars, and the court's attention instantly snapped toward her. She moved with measured precision, her spine perfectly straight under the oversized royal winter coat draped across her shoulders. Her face was entirely hidden behind a thick linen veil. In her hands, she carried a single massive book. It was not one of the dusty tax ledgers, but the damning log of the Old Guard, bound in cracked black leather, smelling of iron gall ink and cellar damp. She stopped in the exact center of the mosaic floor, only a few feet from Jalen. The High Marshal sneered, assuming she was merely another anonymous clerk. But before he could object, Elowen moved first. She pulled the linen veil away, letting it fall to the floor. The collective intake of breath from the tiered benches disturbed the candle flames. A profound, suffocating stillness descended, heavy enough to strip the air from their lungs. Under the unsparing torchlight, the mark of the sovereign silence was fully exposed. The jagged, silver iron scar stretched brutally from her left jaw, wrapping down her neck and disappearing beneath the king's coat. The melted flesh formed the unmistakable sigil of the elite inquisitors, a brand strictly denied in all official histories. Jalen took a sudden step back, his polished confidence shattering as the blood drained from his face. Elowen did not look at him or plead for sympathy. She simply opened the black registry, the spine cracking sharply. She found the page marked by a thin linen ribbon. When she spoke, her voice was the same calm, melodic instrument that had anchored the king through his darkest nights. "Entry 412. Elowen read aloud, the acoustics carrying every consonant to the furthest benches. "The 22nd day of the winter solstice, 10 years prior. Southern borderlands, village of Oakhaven, execution of suspected dissidents, and pacification of witnesses." She turned the heavy book outward, holding it steady so the nearest lords could see the dark seal stamped at the bottom of the parchment. The order was drafted, authorized, and physically signed by High Marshal Jalen Voss. Elowen continued, her voice perfectly even. "The penalty applied to the survivors was the mark of the sovereign silence. I was 13 years old." The room remained entirely paralyzed. Elowen stood as the living synthesis of archival truth and physical consequence. Jalen's argument evaporated. He could not claim the registry was a forgery when the sigil drawn in its margins perfectly matched the brutal brand carved into her face. Jalen looked wildly toward the benches, seeking the conservative allies he had just rallied. But the older lords were already turning away, in mounting horror. Even Varric had taken a microscopic step backward, his cold eyes calculating a new survival strategy. Christian stood up, the slow scrape of his boots against the dais sounding like the drawing of a blade. He descended the stone steps and stopped directly beside Elowen. He did not touch her, respecting her physical boundary in this massive public arena, but his presence formed a heavy, protective wall between her and the collapsing marshal. "You demanded more than anonymous ink, Jalen," Christian said softly, his voice carrying the finality of a closing tomb. "You have your witness. The heavy oak doors of the tribunal hall remained sealed, locking the biting winter wind outside, but the temperature inside the chamber seemed to plummet. Jalen Voss stood frozen, his previous arrogance fracturing under the undeniable reality of the scarred woman standing before him. Elowen did not lower her chin. She let the jagged silver lines of the mark of the sovereign silence catch the pale light filtering through the high clerestory windows, offering no apology for the ruin of her face. Beside Jalen, former Inquisitor General Varric Sloane maintained his polished, rigid posture, though his knuckles had turned stark white where they gripped the wooden railing of the defendant's stand. Christian did not shout. He occupied the silence of the high court the way the northern frost occupied the mountains, without mercy and without the nervous impulse to fill the quiet. He stepped down from the elevated royal dais, holding the infamous black volume in his right hand. The dry rustle of the ancient parchment was the only sound in the cavernous room. He read the names aloud. He read the exact dates of the border purges, the precise financial sums stolen from the southern villages, and the specific orders signed by Varric that authorized the use of branding irons on civilian witnesses. Each word was a calculated hammerstrike against the foundation of the Old Guard. Jalen opened his mouth to protest, to invoke his decades of loyal military service to the crown, but the king raised a single black-gloved hand. The High Marshal's voice died instantly in his throat. Christian's decree was absolute, built on irrefutable documentary proof rather than raw pack dominance. He officially stripped Jalen Voss and Varric Sloane of their military commissions, their inherited lands, their access to the royal treasury, and their aristocratic titles. He sentenced them to permanent, irreversible exile in the freezing outer wastelands, effective by nightfall. There would be no execution, no glorious final stand for the corrupt generals. They would simply be erased from the ledgers of power they had so ruthlessly manipulated. But Christian was not finished. He gestured to the royal guards stationed at the heavy iron doors. Two heavily armored men stepped forward, carrying a rusted lockbox recovered from the restricted lower vaults of the citadel. They dropped it onto the stone floor with a deafening metallic clatter that made several lords flinch. At the sovereign's nod, the guards kicked the lid open. Inside lay the original tools of the Inquisitorial Guard. The heavy iron-wrought branding rods, their cruel tips shaped into the sigil of the sovereign silence, rattled harshly against the stone. Elowen's breath hitched in her throat at the sight of the dark metal that had melted her flesh 10 years ago, but she forced her spine to remain perfectly straight. She did not step back. Christian ordered the guards to throw the irons into the massive central hearth that warmed the tribunal chamber. The court watched in unbroken, terrified quiet as the roaring flames devoured the metal. Christian stepped down to the floor and stood directly beside Elowen, close enough that she could feel the steady warmth radiating from his heavy winter coat, yet maintaining a respectful distance. Together, they watched the iron turn cherry red among the burning oak logs. The cruel, jagged sigils softened, warped, and finally melted into formless liquid scrap, pooling harmlessly in the white ash. The tools of her torment were unmade, reduced to nothing but glowing slag. Varric's face finally lost all its color as he stared at the melting iron, realizing the total structural destruction of his life's work. The guards stepped forward, binding the wrists of the former commanders in heavy hempen hemp rope, and dragged them out of the chamber to begin their long march into the freezing north. The heavy wooden doors closed firmly behind the exiled men, leaving the tribunal hall echoing with a profound structural quiet. The remaining council lords shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed wooden chairs, suddenly hyper-aware of their own vulnerabilities in the face of this newly forged, uncompromising justice. Elowen remained standing in the center of the hall, her discarded linen veil pooled like dirty snow at her feet. She had spent a decade practicing the careful art of invisibility, flattening her physical presence and silencing her footsteps to avoid the disgusted stares of the elite. Now, surrounded by the highest-ranking nobles of the Northern Territories, she felt the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding a heavy shield for a lifetime, only to realize the siege is finally over. Christian turned to face her. His expression was no longer the cold, judicial mask he had worn for the sentencing of the generals. His dark eyes held a quiet, reverent warmth as he closed the distance between them. He did not ask her to cover her face. He did not look at the jagged scars on her cheek with pity or sorrow, but with the profound respect owed to a survivor who had outlasted an empire's cruelty. From the inner pocket of his coat, the young king withdrew an object wrapped in dark velvet. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the great seal of the treasury, a massive, solid brass stamp bearing the ancient crest of the kingdom, used exclusively by the monarch to authorize the restructuring of state law and finances. The council lords held their collective breath as Christian offered the heavy brass cylinder to the quiet archive keeper. Elowen looked down at the seal, her ink-stained fingers hesitating over the cold metal. The old laws required the sovereign to rule alone. The old guard required blind obedience and silent loyalty. Christian was offering her neither of those things. He was offering her the power to rebuild the southern borderlands, to write the new laws of the territory, and to ensure that no quiet village would ever burn in the dark again. She reached out and wrapped her scarred hands around the brass seal, accepting its immense weight. Christian then stepped back, signaling to the royal steward. A simple, elegant circlet of northern gold was brought forth on a velvet cushion. Without a word of grand pageantry or loud declarations, Christian took the crown and placed it gently over Elowen's dark hair. The golden band rested against her brow, catching the bright winter sunlight that spilled through the high clerestory windows. The illumination highlighted every ridge and valley of the melted skin on her neck and cheek. Elowen did not turn away from the glare. She did not reach up to adjust her hair to hide the mark. She stood perfectly still, breathing in the scent of melting beeswax and wood smoke from the hearth, wearing her history openly beside her gold crown. The entire assembly of lords rose to their feet, bowing in deep, unforced respect. Later, when the great hall had emptied, and the evening frost began to creep up the cold stone walls, Christian stood beside her near the dying fire. He did not crowd her boundaries, but stood shoulder to shoulder with her. Watching the embers crackle in the hearth, Elowen traced the heavy brass of the great seal with her thumb, feeling the stillness of a compass needle finding north. Her voice, the same calm, measured tone that had first brought the king peace in the dark of the archives, broke the quiet space between them. She asked him where they should begin tearing down the old border taxes. Christian smiled, a small, genuine expression that reaches his eyes, and told her they would begin wherever she decided. And for the first time in a very long time, she walked through a door without checking first whether she was allowed.